Good afternoon and welcome to Tobacco Control and the LGBTQ plus community. My name is Matt Moonen. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm the Executive Director of Equality Maine. Thank you to everybody out there watching on Facebook Live and on YouTube. We do have Equality Maine staff monitoring the chats on those platforms. So as you engage with our program today, if you have questions, please enter those in the chat and we will get them to our guest speakers. Just as a little bit of background, Equality Maine has joined the Flavors Hook Kids Maine Coalition, and that coalition is working to end the sale of flavored tobacco in Maine. And you may be thinking, why is this an LGBTQ plus issue? It is certainly somewhat different than some of the issues that we and our partners typically work on. And for those of you who are regular viewers of our weekly live stream shows that we do, you may remember a few weeks ago, we brought back our former communications director, Shane Diamond, who shared his story of tobacco use, of being a young queer person in Portland, Maine, going to the bars here, and sort of the culture of tobacco that revolved around some of those places. And he was part of the launch of this campaign to end the sale of flavored tobacco in Maine. So we wanted to follow that up with some folks who have additional insight and additional expertise into this issue, into tobacco control, and who can articulate for us why this matters for LGBTQ people and for our community. So we have some expert guests who we're very excited to have join us. But first, excuse me, losing my voice. We have a very special guest that I want to introduce to you. Her name is Michele Meyer, and she is a state representative serving her second term, and she lives in the town of Elliott. And she is the chair of the Health and Human Services Committee and the sponsor of the bill to end the sale of flavored tobacco in Maine. So Michele, Representative Meyer, my apologies, thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to the show. And what can you tell us?
I am very pleased to be here. Thank you. I am Representative Michele Meyer, serving Southern Maine's House District 2, which is all of Elliott, the town I live in, and parts of Kittery and South Berwick. I served my first term in the Maine House under the leadership of the Honorable Matt Moonen, and I thank Matt and Equality Maine for the opportunity to participate here today. I have spent my professional career as a registered nurse, and in my second term in Augusta, as Matt mentioned, I am the House Chair of the Joint Standing Committee on Health and Human Services. I see my role as a policymaker as a direct extension of my nursing practice. And the ability to affect public health policy in both the immediate as well as impacting the next generation of Maine kids with legislation like my bill to end the sale of flavored tobacco products here in our state. I found it true that the personal is political, and my journey here to the Maine House informs the work I do on behalf of the people of Maine, and tobacco policy is absolutely no exception. I am mom to a gay man, and I don't think I need to convince anyone here today that coming out as a young teen comes with enormous challenges. My son, Will, is an Asian Pacific Islander, and he already stood out as different in a sea of little white faces here in school in Maine. And when he came out in the 90s, the tobacco industry was just beginning to take aim at LGBTQ use. I recall my son at age 14 or 15 telling me that he knew who he was, but he was confused about how to be the person that he was born to be. Obviously, he was struggling with, as we all do, the development of an identity, and the tobacco industry was right there in print, sponsoring events, feeding him the narrative that to be a cool, confident gay guy started with a pack of menthol cigarettes. He went to college in Montreal, and I joined him on one parent weekend in particular that I recall, where it was both parent weekend, the Montreal Jazz Festival, and a Pride event. And I recall all of this, including the parent weekend for McGill University, was sponsored, at least in part, by Kool and Salem cigarettes. Every one of his friends was a menthol cigarette smoker, and while his nicotine habit was thankfully short-lived, my kid fell prey to the predatory marketing practices still being employed by Big Tobacco. And my legislation takes aim at just that, ending the sale of flavored tobacco products. As we all know, tobacco kills more people than any other addiction in adolescence. That's where it's beginning, with the majority of smokers starting in their teens, and most of them with flavored tobacco products, sweet, minty, candy flavored, making it easier for kids to give tobacco and vaping a try. And we all know that the nicotine packed inside is what hooks our kids with generation after generation, subjected to a lifetime of dependence on a substance that inevitably robs them of full and healthy lives. As a society, we have absolutely no tolerance for any person or industry preying on our kids. That the tobacco industry targets vulnerable people in an effort to addict them by enticing them with the perfect complement to their evolving identities is abhorrent. And this is the driver behind my sponsorship of this legislation, and I am quite happy to be here today to talk about it.
Thank you so much, Representative Meyer. That's a fantastic introduction to the topic. And I think a lot of people watching would understand exactly what you're talking about growing up as a young queer person and struggling to figure out who you are and where you fit in. And adding tobacco to that is certainly a problem.
Absolutely.
So we do have, as I said, a couple of special expert guests who have a long history of working on these issues, both here in Maine and across the country. And I'd like to introduce our first guest, who is going to present some incredible information for us. His name is Bob Gordon. He is originally from Portland, Maine, but now serves as the project director for the California LGBT Tobacco Education Partnership. And as co-chair of the San Francisco Tobacco Free Coalition, Bob has worked to end the sale of flavored tobacco through legislative policies. So welcome, Bob, and we'd love to hear everything you have to say. Please take it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's great to be here with my esteemed colleagues, some new friends and some from way back. And it's through the miracle of Zoom that I can be both here in San Francisco, which is my adopted home, and lived here for the last 3 decades. And at the same time, I can feel like I'm back in Maine, where I grew up and I lived as a young adult. So I'd like to share a bit about my personal story. And after that, I have some slides to share that document what Big Tobacco has been up to in my community. So the tobacco industry, the folks who shamelessly addict young people for life, offer products that appeal to kids of all ages. Sweet, minty, spicy, fruity, candy flavors that come in a variety of forms. Blueberry, chocolate flavored little cigars, menthol cigarettes, e-liquids in cotton candy, peach and strawberry flavors, minty chewing tobacco, hookah in flavors like apple and peach and much, much more. Flavors, flavors, flavors. And young people who are the tobacco companies, they're desperate to hook at a young age. And some of these products have leaked into middle schools and high school bathrooms and parking lots. It's an epidemic of addiction that's destined to lead, sadly, to over 20 tobacco-related diseases: heart disease and stroke, asthma, other lung disease, lung cancer, bladder cancer, oral cancer, and more. Okay, so I learned everything. I learned about the tobacco industry, everything I know about the industry, I guess, I learned by coming out as a gay man in Maine. When I was a young adult, having moved back to Portland from college, that was the University of Maine at Orono, and started to work at a local television station in Portland, I decided it was time to find my community. The Underground, which was located at 3 Spring Street, not far from Monument Square, was the big gay dance bar downtown. One night I was determined to go inside, so with great trepidation, afraid that I could lose my job, be shunned by family and friends, I did go inside. It was dark in there, except for the disco music. The disco lights, I mean, and the disco music was blaring. And seemingly out of nowhere, the tuba player from my high school marching band ran over to me and shrieked, "Bobby Gordon, what are you doing here?" And I asked her the very same thing, "What are you doing here?" So we shared some laughs and some memories. Yeah, it was so welcoming and comfortable, discovering an old friend. But what was not comfortable, and what to me was overwhelming, was the sheer amount of cigarettes, smoke, and ashtrays that were in the place. I went home, hair and clothes reeking of tobacco, certainly needing to wash all that out before going to bed, really not giving any thought to the harm that it might be doing to me and my friends. But there was a takeaway from this experience. All that smoking at the Underground, apparently, I thought, this is what it means to be a gay man. Now, I've since learned that it was the commercial tobacco companies that were the vector of this public health epidemic, profiting off of my community, addicting us at an early age, lying to us with their advertising, taking advantage of our vulnerabilities, our stresses, in a world that continues to oppress us and discount us. Now I'm going to attempt to share my screen so we can look at some ads from Big Tobacco together. Okay, I'm going to maximize this screen so I won't see anything else, but you'll see the ads bigger, I believe, in just a minute. There we go. So I know this one is hard to read. You might ask, did R.J. Reynolds, makers of Camel cigarettes, try to get in bed with our community in San Francisco? You tell me as you look at this newspaper ad. It appeared in San Francisco Weekly as part of Pride Month, listing gay bars like the Lexington Club and the Stud, with the headline, "Camel presents these Pride celebration events." And if I may add, we see no pride in Big Tobacco, and they, the tobacco companies, obviously have no shame. Tobacco companies have been coy and vague with us over the years, winking to our lesbian and bi women friends, for example. 3 ads here that ran in a series. On the left, 2 women fishing. Virginia Slim's tagline was, "You've come a long way, baby." I believe the image shows one woman has mistakenly hooked the other woman with her fishing line. The ad reads, "Women aren't opposed to a good line. It just all depends on what it's attached to." The ad in the middle could be read a few different ways, and I think that's the intention of the tobacco companies. It reads, "The best part of taking a break is who you take it with." Or it might have been intended to read, "The best part about taking a break is who you take it with." And the ad on the right goes one step more, in my opinion. We see a woman turning her head to smile in back of her at another woman with this mysterious headline, If you always follow the straight and narrow, you'll never know what's around the corner. Though I'm personally not the target, many women find something queer about this Virginia Slim's ad campaign from Philip Morris Tobacco. Here we see an ad for menthol, Parliament Menthol Lights. The tobacco industry presents us with two men together. Brothers, I imagine. Just kidding. I think that these two men are probably two quite affluent gay men vacationing with their show dog and smoking. Here's R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company once again, co-opting the word pride, winking to the reader with a rainbow on the bottom right corner. The product is candy-flavored snus. Snus are smokeless nicotine products that originated in Sweden. The copy in this ad reads, "Take pride in your flavor. Enjoy smoke-free, spit-free, drama-free tobacco that's packed in a pouch for great tasting, long-lasting, anytime enjoyment." And notice that here, R.J. Reynolds Tobacco created its own mysterious and enticing flavors. Don't you want to know, what does winter chill taste like? Frost, robust, mellow. Now at the bottom of this image, you can see some of the appealing flavors pushed by e-cigarette companies. As they say, delicious top blends for every palate. And we see peanut butter and jelly, waffle, and raspberry tart. This is by an e-cigarette company that was a sponsor of Miami Beach Gay Pride. These nicotine products are not safe ones, and they don't belong at our Pride events. And then there's the pro-tobacco imagery in our magazines. Here's an example from the cover of Out magazine, glamorizing and normalizing tobacco use. The article reads, or the headline or the enticer to get you to read the article says, "Marc Jacobs tells us all about drugs, gay clubs, and his life as America's coolest designer." So with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth, it makes me wonder, was this cover an editorial statement by Out that tobacco use is totally normal, if not sexy and fashionable? Or could it have possibly been a favor to a tobacco company that bought a whole lot of ad pages inside the magazine? I don't have any evidence about that, but it demands further research. And if we've ever wondered what some tobacco executives have thought of our community, we have some evidence in Project Scum as a filthy, dirty scum, that scum. In 1995, R.J. Reynolds began to study the smoking habits of gay men in San Francisco's heavily gay Castro neighborhood, along with the smoking habits of people living on the streets downtown. The word scum, by the way, was a made-up acronym, SCUM, which stood for Subculture Urban Marketing. Hey, we were never supposed to see these documents that called our community scum. The only reason we know about this is that a tobacco control colleague of mine named Ann Landman was at the American Lung Association of Colorado. And she was searching tobacco industry documents using keywords such as the word gay. And Ann sent out an email to her email list. My boss at the health department at the time showed it to me. And I then immediately called up the reporter at San Francisco Weekly and said, "What do you think of this?" Later that week, San Francisco Weekly broke the story. Now, I am so appreciative of investigative journalists, right? And what an embarrassment for big tobacco. In this case, R.J. Reynolds, makers of Red Camel, and who had conducted those focus groups. I'll tell you, it was quite satisfying to see a quote unquote apology from R.J. Reynolds' CEO as a letter to the editor in the next week's issue. And our straight allies were equally upset. A member of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors wrote to the paper and said, "It's racist, classist, it's oppressive, and it's really disheartening to hear, but I can't say that I'm surprised. Low-income communities and people of color have always been derided and taken advantage of. Obviously, the tobacco companies feel like they can make money off of other people's misery." So the tobacco industry continues to push flavors. We insist that ending the sale of flavored and menthol tobacco products is an issue of social justice. Look at this counter industry ad from the state of California. dying for a menthol. They tell you the taste is cool, but 45,000 African Americans die each year from smoking related illnesses. Most of them smoke menthol. How cool is that? This is an issue not just of youth health, but of social justice and equity, because those attracted to menthol cigarettes are disproportionately young people of color and queer people. So to review, Big Tobacco is trying to hook our kids with candy flavored tobacco. In the middle of this image, you see her holding the actual candy, America's best-selling gummy worms. And in her other hand, she's holding toxic e-liquid that looks and smells like the actual gummy worms candy. In another counter ad from SF Kids versus Big Tobacco, you see 3 kids holding fun-looking products, except they're all dangerous tobacco products. E-liquid that looks and smells like Sour Patch Kids candies. Mango and blueberry little cigars that come in the foil packages. And on the bottom image, e-liquid that looks and smells like Nilla wafers. That brings me back to like first grade. And the message is clear. Big Tobacco is targeting our kids with candy flavored tobacco products to get them hooked. And I'll leave you with this last counter industry ad from our San Francisco campaign. You may not be able to read the language, but the images tell the story. Fruity, sweet candy. In the middle is a bottle of e-liquid called Double Stuffed. Looks and smells just like double stuffed Oreo cookie. What young person could resist? And the tobacco companies know it, which is again why they love to sell these enticing youth appealing products. Look, we care about Maine kids. We care about all kids. We care about equality, and we all care about equity. So I want to say it's been great spending time with you, and I wish you all the best of health. And I want to thank you for your kind attention. I'm going to stop sharing and
Wow, Bob. I think we all know that the industry, the tobacco industry, targets particular communities like the LGBTQ community, like the African American community, like people of color communities in our heads. But it's actually quite shocking to see all of those ads just back to back, one after another. So thank you for sharing that with us, because I think we have to see it to really understand how pervasive it is. So thank you for sharing that with us, Bob. I want to turn to our second guest expert. And before we get started, I'll do an introduction. So Scout is the executive director of the National LGBT Cancer Network. He serves as the principal investigator of both the CDC-funded LGBTQ tobacco-related cancer disparity network and OUT, the National Cancer Survey. So I'd like to welcome Scout and turn it over to him to continue on with the program. Welcome, Scout.
Thank you very much. So let me share my screen. Y'all can see me fine, right? Great. I'm taking my own Zoom fatigue trick and hiding my own view. All right, first of all, I just want to say I'm really excited that this is something that's being considered seriously in Maine. I think a lot of people don't realize how this has impacted our communities and a lot of the other underserved populations that overlap with our communities. And let's look into some of the things that are happening, and then maybe you'll get a sense why it can be pretty frustrating watching this type of activity unroll, all this issue with all these different types of flavored tobacco products and what they're doing with our population and other overlapping and related populations. First of all, we already got the introduction. You know who I am. So, as we talk about this, we a while ago got disclosure of all these documents from the tobacco industry. And one of the things it showed us is how far back this idea of targeting our community goes. One of the things, and this is not a story actually about California, it's simply a story about one of the rare times we saw what the tobacco industry does in this kind of situation. So way back in 1998, there was a ballot initiative on the voter rolls in California trying to do a cigarette tax increase. And so interestingly, the tobacco industry decided to recruit one of our community leaders in order to try to engage the LGBTQ plus population to be supporters of this. He claimed that he could get a huge mailing list of people and he could probably get them to neutralize, take a no position stance. He said that the community didn't really have a history of being tobacco industry supportive, but at least he could take us out of the mix. So we weren't a problem for the tobacco industry. And what I thought was really interesting about this is at the exact same time from these documents, we see that the tobacco industry didn't want to be seen to target minority communities, but it was fine to target the LGBTQ plus population. Somehow we were an exception that was just fine. So you see how they unrolled this. One of the things they did was they took the version of Equality Maine and they specifically targeted that organization and getting their lists and talking to their leaders and trying to understand how they could, again, get the leaders, maybe not necessarily to support, but at least not to oppose, so they could neutralize this opposition. And then they created this community expert who they hired, created a list of all these media outlets in the area. So, and it was interesting because there were so many media outlets that they put together, including what it cost to buy the biggest ad in all of these media outlets for weeks and weeks in a row before the actual vote ended up coming up. And the interesting thing was for all those media outlets, I know it was a while ago, it was only $45,000 to basically buy it up as far as media ads. And of course, with the tobacco industry, we understand, you'll see what $45,000 is compared to what they ultimately spent on the campaign. And then, of course, the expert in our communities worked with them to come up with the themes that might resonate with our population. And as he probably appropriately said, and these are themes we can probably think really still resonate today, the idea of having our lifestyle regulated was something that we would chafe against. Government intrusion into our private lives was something we would chafe against. And any concept of removing our own choice was something we would chafe against. So they deliberately set out to come up with tobacco ads about these themes, because for them, they understood that it was really important to set the tone of the debate to be something that was going to be favorable to the tobacco industry. And just to show you, you saw earlier, $45,000 was what they said it was going to cost to buy up every LGBTQ plus media outlet they could in the whole state for the whole duration of the campaign. And that's just a drop in the bucket compared to the fact that they were spending $1.4 million, and that's just for one phase of this campaign. So one of the things that I think really strikes home to me is whenever we're talking about the tobacco industry, we're so completely outspent in circles. And so we have to understand when voices are speaking up that might potentially be people who are allied with, or messages that are allied with or ultimately funded by the tobacco industry. And just to put that in context, if you aren't familiar with it, on the most recent year, they've done an analysis. This is how much the tobacco industry spends every single day on marketing. So that means it's a little less than $1 million an hour in the United States alone on marketing. So again, it gives you a sense of when we're trying to put out pro-health messages, what it is we're up against when we have obviously the CDC or any of the pro-health organizations. We do not have $1 million an hour to put out in messaging. So it's kind of not exactly a balanced scale when there's all these multinational corporations putting this messaging out in the field. But in California, I'm happy to say they still lost. And that wasn't the beginning of the targeting. As I think Bob had showed this ad, they have a history going back before it. And you can see this lovely thing where all they have is on the left is the ad without a gay man. On the right, they just add one more guy and suddenly it becomes a very gay resonant ad. You see the same thing happening in this one here. This time they've added a woman. So they've taken one of their mainstream ads over on the right there, add another woman, and suddenly they drop it into an LGBTQ plus magazine, and it's really resonating with our population. And one of the interesting things that happened is that as they did As our own community members did focus groups with our population, later they found out that honestly, if you looked at it, we were grateful to the tobacco industry because so few organizations had ever targeted our population in any kind of advertising that we developed a lot of support of the tobacco industry because they were early advertisers in our media. And of course, you see them doing the same thing with international ads as well. Both of these come from other countries. The real message here is we are, unfortunately, because we have experienced so much stigma and so much social isolation and discrimination, we're an easy and a cheap market for any corporation, honestly, to curry favor with. And the tobacco industry was really interested in currying favor all up and down the board. Just as one other example, we know that in 1999, Philip Morris spent $60 million in our communities in corporate giving. And then they spent $100 million to tell us how amazing they were for being one of the few corporations that was giving us money. So again, you can kind of see the mercenary approach to a lot of this. And to this day, Philip Morris's new incarnations and all the tobacco industry new incarnations end up becoming leaders in the corporate equality index. If they weren't selling something that results in death when used as directed, they would actually be amazing organizations to work for if you're an LGBTQ plus person, because they do so much to be supportive of our populations in their corporation. Of course, because that also helps their bottom line. So then this kind of stuff that, I learned about this one example from California many years ago, but then in working as running the LGBTQ Tobacco and Cancer Disparity Network that CDC funds, I kept running into more and more examples of this sort of stuff. And remember, most of tobacco industry's tactics are very hidden. They do not want us to see what they're doing. But I'd find things out, like we were trying to do a cessation intervention in Chicago and San Diego, as a matter of fact. And bar owners in both places told us that they were actually banned from doing cessation. Why would a bar owner be banned from doing anything having to do with tobacco cessation? Because they were taking underwriting from the tobacco industry, whether it was in product placement or things like that. But the underwriting came with a caveat that they could never do anything related to smoking cessation. Or North Carolina, as I was actually just starting this work, when one of the organizers of Pride in North Carolina told us that he was offered the car, any car of his choice, simply to allow the tobacco industry to sponsor Pride in North Carolina. Is it true or not? I have no idea, but it's certainly the story that was told to me about something that happened pretty early on. We had an example in Missouri when actually they were trying to pass legislation against the tobacco. I think they were trying to do clean indoor air in Missouri, as a matter of fact. And you saw LGBTQ business owners speak up and write in the local media that they were going to be disproportionately hurt if there was clean indoor air in Missouri. And the locals didn't know who this business owner was. And we looked it up, and it turned out, oh, the same business owner somehow also seems to be a local business owner in Washington state. And when the same kind of thing happened in Washington state, he also wrote about how his local business, this time he wasn't queer, was going to be disproportionately hurt. And then in the same year, actually, we saw that the tobacco industry offered in Missouri, as you can imagine, Pride can be kind of hot in the middle of the summer. They offered a whole bunch of air-conditioned trailers as long as they were allowed to have a smoking area at Pride. So again, when you've got lots of resources, it's really easy to do very enticing things. And then one of the other things we've seen, like in Missouri with that clean indoor air ban, is we've had people in Rhode Island, Washington, D.C., and Georgia each time speak up. And I'm talking to you from Rhode Island right now, where it's also snowing like in Maine, just in case you thought you're the only outlier here. That in each of these states, bar owners stood up, supported by the tobacco industry, and said, our queer bars are going to be disproportionately hurt if you pass clean indoor air. As a matter of fact, in my state, the clean indoor air ban took 2 more years to go into place for small bars because those gay bar owners stood up and protested it. So they have a history all around the country of using our community members to speak up in pro-tobacco capacities each time, twisting the information about our own community's support, or mostly our own community's lack of support. At the same time, they were saying that there was evidence showing that we were more likely to pay for a smoke-free bar than the mainstream population. So again, you can see they twist the information. But now, years keep piling on. There's a new tactic out there. The new tactic has to do is we see more and more regulation related to combustible cigarettes. The newest thing out there is vaping. And as Bob had talked about, what you see here on the top are pictures of tobacco industry products. What you see here on the bottom are pictures of candy. So as Bob had also showed those pictures of, the tobacco industry is claiming, their big statement is that vaping, as we do know it's better than a combustible cigarette, is a great way to get people who've been smoking combustible cigarettes to stop. But what they don't want to talk about very much is how they also have a little bit of a side benefit of actually addicting a whole new generation of people to tobacco products as well. And while there's actually a lot of information now that vaping e-cigarettes doesn't necessarily help people who are on combustible cigarettes to actually stop. They can switch, but they don't necessarily stop. So at the same time, evidence continues to grow that it doesn't even really help in that end. There's like a tidal wave of new youth being addicted to nicotine via these candy and menthol flavored tobacco products. We also know, just FYI, there's evidence now that if you ban one of the flavors or a flavor in some areas, like they banned all flavors but menthol for Juul a couple of years ago, basically they found out there's 1,000% increase in use of other tobacco products where flavors were allowed. And also there was a huge increase in menthol. So if you try and close down one street but leave others open, people just go right around it to do the other street so they can get access to the flavors. Oops, this is not actually it's supposed to be the only thing on here. Hold on, let me see if the next one. Oh, they're all coming on one by one. Okay, sorry. So I talked about that old school advertising and targeting that used to happen with the queer communities. Unfortunately, this is the new version of it. We now see things like, I went down to Miami Pride in 2014, and Vaporfy was all over the place as the sponsor of Miami Pride. Bob showed these snooze ads. They were in media outlets all across the country a few years ago. We see Enjoy, Blue. They're definitely, once again, leaning into our population to try and make sure that we're listening and that we're buying. So what do we have right now is the information. Depending on which year you look at, either 1/4 or 1/3 of our youth are using electronic vapor products and getting addicted to nicotine by that. Usually about 90% of the youth who use them are using these flavors. And youth vaping has been labeled an epidemic by CDC. There is a Monitoring Our Futures survey, which has been going on for about 30 years. And in all those 30 years, it's never had a bigger increase in the health risk than it has in vaping over just 1 year. So it really is something where this is standing above the crowd of all the other health things that are going on with youth, standing out as being really singular. And unfortunately, of course, it's really easy to get addicted to nicotine. And we do know that nicotine also unfortunately, vaping does actually move people now to smoking combustible cigarettes. As I'm sorry to say, as Representative Meyer had talked about with her son, my son also has started with vaping. He has now moved to combustible cigarettes. And unfortunately, that's still the case. So he is still using them now. We also see that it affects underserved populations within our own community disproportionately. Black trans youth are 6 times more likely to vape than others. So again, if you are experiencing dual or triple minority status, your chances of trying to get free from this or get away from it or be clear of it go down. And so, we think that, the tobacco industry, maybe they aren't doing some of these tactics necessarily anymore, right? But this is actually some slide excerpts from a conference I was at just late last year. And it was interesting because I was listening to this guy talk about harm reduction and how vaping might be a harm reduction answer for people with HIV. He was a community member, a leader, but his slide deck was really slick. He presented a conflict of interest disclosure at the beginning of it, and it didn't have any kind of conflict of interest related to the tobacco industry, but his slide deck was so slick. The things he brought up were just such carefully cherry-picked little statistics that I Googled him, and sure enough, he is a paid associate of a think tank that is tobacco industry think tank. And I don't know why that wasn't disclosed on this conflict of interest. And I got back to the organization and I said, you guys, this guy is actually, he has a conflict of interest that was not disclosed from the tobacco industry. And they said, oh, but he's presenting this for so many years. He's really been a good friend. I'll tell you what. And I actually pitched a fit and I said, I don't want him on my presentation. And they just ended up moving him to another presentation. So again, we have to be careful about who we're listening to in our own communities, because sometimes the messages that they're bringing don't necessarily reflect something that is independent. And just to tell you, we've done the estimate in 2020, we spend as a set of communities about $2.6 billion on the tobacco industry. And that is just cigarettes. It doesn't count all these other products. So my question is, how much lower is that than the real reality? And this is a lot more money than any of the funders spent on LGBTQ issues at all. So again, this is really financially lucrative for the tobacco industry. So my question is, in Maine and with everywhere, as we see this old Lucky Strike ad, dude, that's so gay, we'll be there. Is there any way that we, as the people who really care about the health of our communities and aren't paid for by the tobacco industry, can we disrupt this effort that they have to get us to buy and think that it's freedom, or that it's really about cessation, or that it really isn't affecting kids and we're not targeting you? Those are all the messages they'll want to say. And is there some way that we can disrupt that messaging and really get a message of health to our youth before it's too late for them and they struggle for years, decades even, to try and get out from under the addiction? That is what I've got. I'll stop there.
Wow, thank you, Scout. I can't get over the $1 million an hour thing. There was so much in what you presented, but that is just like stuck in my head right now. We got a question from a viewer that I would love to throw at you and Bob first, and while I look up some additional information. The question is, there's been a lot in both of your presentations about marketing, and we've seen lots and lots of examples in your presentations. Can you tell us how the rates of smoking and use of tobacco compare for LGBTQ people compared to non-LGBTQ people? And I do know I have some statistics, so I'm happy to look those up.
Great. I've got some. Yeah, if you actually look at it, it's interesting because according to the biggest information in the MMWR, we were at 60% higher rates of cigarette smoking than the general population a few years ago, back when we started to monitor it, right? And so that was a 60% increase over general population. It's since been going down to 50 and down to 40 for cigarettes. But then they changed it to start to actually monitor not just cigarettes, but all tobacco use. And guess what? Now we're heading back up and we're at 50% and rising. So we used to be 60% higher with cigarettes. We're all the way down to 40%. So we're closing the gap. But once you add in all those other tobacco products, heading the other direction.
Bob, anything that you want to add to that? You're on mute.
Thank you. Yeah, I was going to say, I know that things have changed since my smoky nights at the underground, thanks to policy, right? So I think that a lot of things have brought that tobacco use down. I mean, when you're in Maine, and I worked at a television station, actually it was the second place in the state after Blue Cross, I think it was, to have a voluntary policy. The CEO of the system said, after he had a heart attack, and he said, we're not going to have smoking anymore. And it was a huge shock, a huge policy change for employees who had been there for years and years. And I remember those employees struggling, going out on a day colder than today, okay? Snowy, windy, rainy days, out in that parking lot. And, but you know what? It got a few of them to make attempts to quit smoking. And that's what these policies, they help bring down, when we reduce availability of tobacco, when we help people who are really struggling and give them free treatment on demand, frankly, in a cultural way, in language, when we help folks down, we can bring those rates down. And again, they're not rates, they're our family members. We all have family members, either who we've lost or who are still struggling right now.
Now I was on mute. Thank you both for those answers. I was able to find some stats that I want to highlight for the folks watching, and of course for the person who asked the question. So LGBTQ adults smoke at rates 2.5 times higher than non-LGBTQ adults. And when you look at the transgender population, 1 in 3 transgender adults smoke cigarettes compared to 1 in 7 among all adults. And finally, among kids, 4 out of 5 kids who have used tobacco report that they started with a flavored product. So the numbers are just overwhelming when you really start to focus on them. I'd love to bring in Representative Meyer back to the panel if we could. Representative Meyer, can you tell us a little bit about where we go from here? You've got this great piece of legislation that is hopefully going to make a dent in this giant problem that Bob and Scout have just laid out for us. What is the status of the bill right now?
Bill will be printed by early next week, scheduled for its public hearing likely first week of May, and hopefully out for a vote by the end of May. And I also want to add that I spent the entire time rapt attention at those 2 presentations, just shaking my head. And it is sobering to connect the dots and realize what has gone on. It really is. When we did our a presentation on menthol and race, afterward, I heard from so many legislators who just never put it together, the predatory marketing practices of the tobacco industry. And I'm hopeful that anyone watching today, either live or in its replay, will be similarly aghast at how abhorrent it is that the LGBTQ plus community has been targeted as well. So there have been, health destroyed and lives lost, and I'm really proud to stand with all of you in making a difference here.
Well, Representative Meyer, thank you so much for your leadership on this. If folks want to know how they can help, what would your answer be? And I have my own, of course, but.
Well, I am going to count on you to let folks know what the LD number is when it's assigned, and the process by which to submit testimony and come before the Joint Standing Committee on Health and Human Services and provide testimony. Again, I will leave that to the good folks at Equality Maine to get that information out, as well as my contact information for anyone who has additional questions or wants to know what the process is and how they can get behind this legislation and help us get it over the finish line.
Thank you so much, Representative. Yeah, just to build on that, as I said at the outset, Equality Maine is very proud to be a part of the Flavors Hook Kids Maine Coalition. So please follow them on Facebook for regular updates on what's happening with this legislation. Of course, Equality Maine will be working on this legislation as well, and we want to highlight the voices and experiences of LGBTQ Mainers who have tobacco use in their past, in their present, whatever it may be. And so please follow our updates on social media. Make sure you're on our email list, because we will send out action alerts when it's time to email your legislator and support this bill. So please sign up for that if you haven't already. Well, we are almost out of time. I would invite any of our expert guests to share some closing thoughts before we wrap up. No pressure, but if you want to.
I would say one of the things that occurs to me is, as Bob had also noted, if you just ask any group of people, or if you spend a couple minutes thinking, there's probably not one among us who hasn't really been impacted by tobacco use at some level. And, this idea that we've got a quarter to a third of the queer youth being addicted to something before they even get to the age of 18, you know, something that we all know is more addictive than heroin, you know, so it takes so long to get that monkey off your back, you know. It's you know, if you've been impacted by tobacco use and then you realize what's kind of the next wave coming down for queer youth, usually there's a lot of people who have opinions about that. So I hope that people in Maine will, you know, say that publicly, you know, have that, put that in the dialogue. Don't be quiet. If you've got an opinion, speak up.
Yeah, I would just say that people who have struggled to quit nicotine either successfully or who are still struggling, some have told me things like, you call it a public health problem. For me, it's a solution. It's what helps me get through those stressful times. It's what helps me get through, you know, being alone, isolated during COVID. It's what, if I'm angry, if I have a job, you know, the boss yells at me, or if I'm celebrating, or if I'm just bored. Nicotine is so useful for people. And so if we can get under that, and of course, tobacco industry knows that best, and that's why they are the vector of this epidemic. So even though we have these sky high rates and so forth, we should never, ever take blame on ourselves. We should help each other out and listen to each other and understand how difficult and complicated this can be, and that there really is a lot of love and support. I believe 1-800-QUIT-NOW is available anywhere in the United States. And I know Maine has its own quit line, as do most of the states. But it's the industry. And I'm proud to speak out today with my colleagues that we pointed a finger at who started this and who continues this and who continues to do this. And they just hide and they change their tactics and they change their flavors and their colors and their spots, but they continue to do it. And people continue to be addicted at a young age and continue to die.
Yeah, Bob, thank you so much for that. I think for those of us who work on policy, it's so easy to get tunnel vision and think only about policy, but you bring up important resources that we want to make sure viewers know about. So you mentioned 1-800-QUIT-NOW. That is a hotline that is open 24/7 for folks who want to quit tobacco. And also there's MaineQuitLink.com. That's Maine Quit, QUIT, link.com, MaineQuitLink.com. So if you want access to some resources to help you quit, please check both of those out. Well, Bob, Scout, Representative Meyer, thank you so much for giving us an hour of your time on this incredibly important topic. Your expertise has just been really impressive and moving, and we can't wait to continue our work together on this important legislation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Go Maine.
And thank you to everybody for watching. Have a good weekend.
You too.